So good afternoon. We'll get going in just a second. Right, to those watching the market, you had a really good end of the day today, primarily because the Fed announced that they're not going to do anything. Basically, Jerome Powell, who's the chairman of the Fed, announced that the Fed was not going to make any changes to their current policy, change rates. The Fed, if you don't realize this, buys bonds. They keep that market high, so it keeps the rate fairly stable. Basically announced they're not changing anything until 2023 for all intents and purposes. So stocks respond to, we've talked about this many times, stocks respond to levels of certainty. And if we know the organization isn't going to take any steps to change anything, then the market can just kind of go wild. So it's going to be an interesting year in the market. If you are not someone who saves and invests and buys stocks and buys what have you, it's a good time to start. It's a very good time to start your retirement funds. And if you have kids, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later on in the podcast, but if you have kids, now is a good time to get them going. Start paying attention, learn some basic finance. It's a perfect time to do so. To those watching, good afternoon. Jennifer, how are you? Elizabeth, Mary, Dorothy, and a few other texts have come in. We have messages that come in from a few different areas. So, and I just read, this wasn't one of the topics for the conversation, but I just read kind of a messed up story out of East Haven. In East Haven, Mike Malisi, who I know personally, is a good guy, is the assessor and been the assessor for like 30 years. And he's in a meeting last week, and he says there was a move to push one of his office members to part-time from full-time. And he said his people are overtaxed, and some people did some work without being paid out of their own free will. And in response to that, the administration put him on leave, saying that he allowed people to work without being paid. And I got to tell you something, there's something that reeks of some sort of payback or some bullshit going on in East Haven, because that's not that bad. You know, if an employee decided to do an extra work or do some work on the way home or to try to get ahead, that's normal. It happens all the time. It'd be nice if everybody can get paid, but if somebody who cared about their job so much spent a few extra hours getting work done, and he went forward and vouched for them and tried to get them extra pay, and the response instead was, all right, let's get them some extra pay. The response was, let's relieve you of your job to investigate this. I haven't looked into it in any great detail. I just read the article in the New Haven Register, what I saw today, but something reeks there. I would be, if I worked for Malisi, I'd be so proud that he went forward and trying to fight on my behalf and get me paid and get that position put back in. Instead, the administration turned around and put him on leave. I will look more into that for next week, but Jesus Christ. I mean, come on. That's just a little bit much. And you can look into that issue without putting the guy on administrative leave. I hope he's still being paid, but something weird out of East Haven. I'll be looking into that. I'll look into that and talk about it more next week. In any event, I want to talk about tonight's Board of Ed meeting in Branford. We're going to spend a lot of time on education issues over the last, I would say, 2 or 3 weeks. We've had what I can say was a very successful activism campaign by parents who were not normally involved. They actually got school open earlier. It's great to see the administration responded, not with a perfect plan, but with a plan to open school earlier on a phase level, and it worked. But then we get tonight's Board of Education meeting. So a little bit of background here. The parents, and maybe a little late to this process, the parents went and got a petition signed, and by the law, if you get a certain amount of signatures on this petition, you force a public hearing on the Board of Education. Now, since that petition went in, changes have happened to school reopening that many of those parents may not have as big of concerns as they did before. There's still some concerns about accountability and some issues by the Board of Ed, but the Board of Ed probably could have just handled this last week. Instead, Hamlin Hernandez, the superintendent, said there were some legal issues on whether or not you can get signatures online instead of in person. All of this is nonsense and bullshit. There's no other way to describe this. There's no reason a lawyer should be paid for any of this. They should have just had the public hearing and called it a day. It is amazing that we have administrators fighting against hearing from the public. That is just an amazing thing. It's not normal. It's just, why do you want this job if you're so actively fighting against hearing from the public? I get the public can be a pain in the ass. I get that. And there are some members, not this group, but there are some members that have gone to every meeting and called everybody names and are disgusting. Always true. Happens in every town and happens on the town side. We know that. And it's happened with the Board of Ed too. In general, most parents aren't that way. And we clearly have this. Our administration is going into meetings as if it's going to be a war. They're not going into meetings and saying, hey, let's work together to make this happen. They're going into meetings to silence the public. This is going to be combative and let's fight preemptively. The fact that any lawyer is involved to determine if signatures can be counted if filed online instead of in person during COVID is comical and absurd. But this is what the Hamlet-Hernandez administration does. It's crazy. It never should have happened. That said, here's some items on the agenda tonight. And I don't know. Executive session. Executive session means no public, not recorded, done privately. Discussion of attorney-client privileged communication regarding petition for public hearing under Section 10238 of the Connecticut General Statutes. What the hell? What attorney-client privilege communication could there be regarding whether or not you can hold a public hearing based on signatures from parents? This is absurd. The whole purpose of executive session is that you hold it in private if it's going to put the district or the town or the government entity at some sort of especially financial or legal issue. So in executive session, you talk about handing a contract to one and reviewing various bids on contracts because it can put you at a disadvantage. Potential legal settlements or legal strategy. There's no lawsuit here. The town's not being sued. The Board of Ed's not being sued. Parents got together. They filed a petition. They put it forward. That's it. Having an executive session about procedure is not a legal executive session. Now and to make it legal, to act like they're okay to go in executive session, they put attorney-client privileged communication. The hell does that mean? All communication between the Board of Ed and an attorney is not privileged. It only works under executive session if it in some way, shape, or form puts the town at a disadvantage. I will put an FOI request in for this and a complaint to the Freedom of Information Board. This makes zero sense and just reeks of the attitude we're seeing over and over and over again from the administration of let's be combative. Instead of let's be inclusive, let's work together, it's let's be combative. It's nonsense. It's nonsense that this is on the agenda at all. It should have been solved last week. Listen to the public. Last week, they had discussion on a public hearing, and then later on, they had discussion on a reopening of schools earlier. All they had to say was, you know what? Let's have the public hearing discussion after so everybody can hear about reopening, and the problem might solve itself. No. We had a 15-minute discussion over, can you legally count signatures that were done online? I think change.org or whatever it was, a program they use, which is used all the time, by the way, including by the White House, where you can go and sign for petitions. So Hamlet, instead of just accepting it and working with the public, said, let's get a lawyer involved. Let's pay a lawyer to come in and say whether we can accept these signatures or not. What the hell? And now an executive session with an attorney? What is this attorney's hourly rate? Why are we paying an attorney for absurdities? And this is why I go back to the Board of Education. I ask a very simple question. Your job as a Board of Ed is to hold the administration accountable. When you see bullshit, say it. Use the word. I don't care. No parent's going to care. When you see nonsense, call it out. This is crazy. This is absurd. A massive, massive waste of time. A massive, massive waste of money. For nothing. An administration just wasting time trying to find ways not to engage the public. And I'm going to go back to the Board of Ed members. I know one of these Board of Ed members were appointed. And I'm not being critical of you right now. I'm telling you about going forward because we're going to get to CABE in a second. You're elected. Whether you're appointed to fill out somebody's elected term or not, you're elected by me and those parents. Not by CABE, not by Hamlin Hernandez, not by the administration in the school. In fact, almost none of the administration in Branford is from Branford. A drastic change from 10 years ago, where many were. Almost all the local people are gone. And so now we have to waste time and money in what appears to be potentially illegal executive session, because this is certainly not the purpose of an executive session. To be able to go behind closed doors and have a conversation about whether or not you can have a hearing on a petition is procedural. There's nothing executive session worthy on that. And I've been in FOI hearings. I've never come close to hearing this. I've never seen this on the town side. The town side has executive sessions when they're giving out a contract, when they are settling a lawsuit over taxes or what have you, where clearly the information has to be privileged because you don't want another side to know it. Like if you're settling a lawsuit and discussing that settlement, you don't want the other side of that lawsuit to hear this in a public session. That would be unfair to the taxpayers. What's unfair to the taxpayers about talking to a lawyer about whether you can have a public hearing? How is that privileged information? Between who and who? And now you're going into executive session for it? This is a serious pile of bullshit. This is nonsense. And quite frankly, the question I have, typically they vote to go into executive session. So John Prins, the chairman, will say, all right, we need to go into executive session. Could I have a motion? And somebody say, make a motion. We go to, and somebody seconds that and they vote. Vote no. Vote no. Have the discussion in public. There is nothing here that makes sense. Now, I'm going to trust that having someone like Peter Burdon on the Board of Ed will be helpful here. He's a lawyer. He's familiar with some of this stuff. I know he's been in Freedom of Information hearings. But they're taking advantage of the fact that so many of these members are new. Most of these members have been on for less than a year and a half. I think two have been, John Prins and what's her name? Kevin's wife. Joanne Boris has been on there for longer. Everyone else is relatively new. And so this is what happens when Board of Ed members get on. They get on and somebody says to them, you got to be careful what you say. You got to be careful what you respond to because there's legal issues and there's all this nonsense. Well, let's move further down this agenda. In this agenda, I'm going to tell you this story. I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years ago, there was a significant issue that parents were coming to meetings over en masse. They were upset. They weren't getting answers. There was a lot of conflict between the Board of Ed and the chair and the public. And so what they did is they had CABE come in, an attorney from CABE. CABE is, I don't know, the Society of Board of Education members or some nonsense like that. And towns have the ability to sign up with this organization. CABE is basically a lobbying group that provides guidance to boards of education. They can lobby this government for new laws, state for new laws, what have you. They give guidance on employee law. They give guidance on policy. They give guidance on all this stuff to boards of education. It is not mandatory. They are not a legislative body, but each Board of Ed pays a lot of money each year to CABE. In addition, CABE offers a ton of consulting services, we'll say, where they hire people, usually retired professionals. Suppose like Hamlet Hernandez retires and he goes works for CABE and they pay him money to go analyze some school district. So you have this kind of ugly, incestuous kind of circle where boards of ed and executive and administrators really push to be members of CABE. They retire, they get work from CABE. They push for people to be members of CABE. And CABE goes a little bit further. They make sure like members from Board of Education from all over the state are on their board of CABE. So they're really, really good at keeping their members up and getting tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars from towns. They don't have all towns. You don't have to be a member of CABE. On the board of CABE happens to be John Prinz, who is the chairman of the Branford Board of Education. What CABE says is not law. It is not binding. They're just advisors. So a few years back, they have this lawyer come down and kind of give this speech to the public. And it was all this very, we're wondering what our role is as the Board of Ed. What can we say to the public? And the advice was basically don't answer questions to the public. Don't respond with them because it could be misconstrued that you as an individual are speaking for the board. It was crazy. In that meeting, I got up and said, this is nuts. Makes no sense. It's amazing. The town pays CABE tens of thousands of dollars. They pay a CABE attorney then to come in and tell them that the board should not respond to the public and shouldn't be. It's just fucking crazy. And so here we are. After this whole thing where parents get involved, they put a petition forward. They get change done. They come to meetings like crazy. There's very real discussions at Board of Ed meetings with the chairman cutting off other members, not allowing them to ask questions of the public. And we go to the agenda, presentation, Board of Education role and responsibilities from CABE. What the hell? The general tenor of this Board of Education, and I'm using general as a term because I know most of these, I know Meredith Gaffney's not that way. I know Christina Cantu's not that way. I know Peter Bredun's not that way. But this is what's coming from the leadership. They may have no say what's on the agenda, but this is what's coming from the leadership. This is how you're being perceived because this is how the board is acting. Again, not individual members. I would even argue not the majority of the board. Just those that are making decisions. What are you having a presentation for? You're elected. You know who determines the role of the Board of Education? The state legislature. So what you'll get here is CABE's determination of what the state legislature has said is the role of the Board of Education. That's what you'll get. You'll get advice about not saying anything, not sharing opinions, not speaking for the board. And you know what? Here's what you could do with that advice. Shove it. You're elected. And I guarantee you, nobody is going to run for office this November saying, I'm going to listen to whatever CABE tells me to do. Because that person will lose. And I'll swear to you now, I will have every candidate that is willing to come on this podcast and I will ask them that question. What do you feel the role of CABE is? If they tell me they're advisors and nothing more, and we take their advice with a huge grain of salt, okay, I'll accept that. But to come in and present what they think the role of the Board of Education is, their opinion of it, give me a break. Anybody can open up the state legislature's laws and find out Board of Education and read what they're supposed to do. Period. It's not that hard. This is another attempt to basically say, dear public, we're better than you. You shouldn't expect answers from us. You can ask away, but you're out of line, and this is what we're going to do. And a member of the board of CABE also happens to be the chairman of the Branford Board of Education, and is scheduling CABE to give another report. What the hell? Really? Is that where we are? This is kind of crazy. It's absurd. It's happened before. Why can't we err on the side of just having a conversation? Guys, you have questions, come forward. We'll answer what we can. We're not going to answer private, this student's educational record or personal psychiatric record or medical record. Of course we're not. No one expects you to answer those questions. What are the processes to open school? Not a crazy question. What's held this up? Not a crazy question. Who the hell knows? It's absurd. I'm going to read some of these comments in a second, but it's absurd. The first thing about tonight, so Jennifer, I'm reading you, should we challenge them on why this is linked on BPS site tonight and note the state and not the state? So listen, CABE are basically hired as consultants, and they give you what the state laws mean. Now, having a consultant isn't a bad thing. A consultant can say, all right, here's what the state legislature has determined, and here are some other laws that have been determined by the judicial branch to indicate what should or shouldn't happen. So having a consultant isn't bad. The fact that they link to it isn't terrible. Remember something, it's not the law. It's CABE's interpretation of the law. And remember something else, Board of Ed members are elected by the members of the district they're serving, not by CABE. So anybody telling you that Board of Ed members can't say something or can't respond to something is simply not true. You can respond to anything you want. You're responsible for your actions. You can't give out information that is private to a student. But by the way, 150 towns are part of CABE. That's the cycle we see. It's part of academia, right? They all join. They all join. They all join. They all join. If they're being sent like laws, they're not laws. They're their interpretation. Let's put it this way. When you have an issue, criminal issue or legal issue, and you go to a lawyer, you're hearing his interpretation. When you see a court case, you generally see lawyers with very drastically different interpretations. CABE has one interpretation of the law. You can take it. It may be valuable. In the past, they have suggested Board of Ed members not answer questions to people, not respond in public meetings. I sat there when they said that. I laughed at it. And anyone who's elected, I ask a very simple question. Would you run for office on that platform? Would you run for office on the platform of, I'm going to listen to CABE as opposed to respond when I can to issues with the public? And I don't mean when I can legally, when I know the answer. We've had meetings now where the chairman shut off Board of Ed members, not allowing them to ask questions, claiming falsely it's a special meeting so you can't ask questions. We've had that. This presentation tonight is basically to the public to say, here's why we're not going to tell you what you want to know. To have this discussion in executive session makes zero sense. I'd love to know what the reason was to have this in executive session. That they said it has anything to do with privileged communication between a client and attorney. What? The discussion is a legal interpretation of whether or not you can have signatures for a public meeting. You said this at the last meeting. And that's privileged? How? We need answers to that. We need the board members, before they vote, to say, I want some real answer before I go in executive session. I want to know how this information being public puts us at a disadvantage. You're discussing procedure? By the way, a conversation which shouldn't be happening anyway. It should have just been solved by any rational, reasonable member. This would be over last week. Anybody with a brain should have said, hold on a second. We know this is all about reopening school early. Let's get to that presentation first and then revisit this. Anybody with any level of common sense would have said that. I was watching it saying, how the hell is this happening? How is this possible? That we're spending 15 minutes on Hamlet rambling on about the legal question of whether or not you can have it's COVID. You're not going to do anything in person. This is how reasonable you are? This was literally a 15-minute conversation in the last meeting. While all the parents sat there waiting for what's the plan to reopen, this is 15 minutes of our conversation. Give me a break. Now it's executive session? What the hell is going on? I don't know who's doing the agenda. Is it Prince? Is it Hamlet? Is it Hamlet's staff? I don't know. But the agenda is written like a group of people who are afraid. And you're 10 times better off by just being open. Parents only care about their kids. And you're sitting there pretending everybody's out to sue you and out to get you. Have an open conversation, for Christ's sake. This is getting crazy. The agenda tonight is absurd. I don't understand. I don't get it. How are we not erring on the side of being open? No one's expecting you to give out healthcare information for individual students. There is no HIPAA laws being broken here. You have a procedural question on whether or not you should go into executive session or whether or not you can have a public hearing, then have the discussion. There's nothing privileged. This makes no sense. I'm just blown away. By the way, every communication with a lawyer is now privileged. I don't have words for this. This is basically saying that because every communication with a lawyer is privileged, that anything that comes from a lawyer can only be discussed in executive session. That's not true. That won't hold up by law. That won't hold up with the Freedom of Information Commission. And the Board of Ed members should say, no, we'll discuss it right here in the open. We don't need this. We don't need to go to executive session. We don't need to hide from the public. We'll have this discussion in the open. I don't care what the lawyer says. Period. The lawyer can give his interpretation of what he thinks the rule is. That's fine. Your interpretation of whether or not you can accept signatures is not something for executive session. And then having CABE come in, they're going to explain the same thing they did 3 or 4 years ago on here's what you shouldn't do, and this will get you in trouble, and this will get you. Nonsense, you're elected. And if you're a Board of Ed member, while that presentation is going on, ask yourself one very simple question. Would I run for office with my platform being, I'll defer to CABE? Just ask that question. Period. Because nobody would. Everybody runs for office on, we're going to be open, we're going to be transparent, we're going to be honest. You know who else ran this way? Hima Hernandez, when he didn't run for office, but first got the job. My ears are going to be open. I'll be listening. I haven't seen it. And tonight's agenda is all about how do we avoid the public? How do we do things behind closed doors? How do we avoid transparency? And how do we hide? And to the person who said it's a slap in the face, disrespectful to parents, that's exactly what it is. There's this sense of disdain from the leadership of how dare we have to deal with this? And it's not from, and I don't want to go through every member because I don't want to leave any members out, but for the most part, I don't see it from the members of the Board of Ed. Yeah, from Prins. On the board of CABE, yeah. I don't think Prins is a bad guy. But he gets lost in this shit. And I think there's enough members on this board that would like to lean on the side of openness, but because they're so new, they hesitate to say something. You know what? Say it. Be wrong. Who gives a shit? Say it. I want a reason why this is an executive session. Period. And they tell you because there's some privileged information with the lawyer. If the lawyer is not comfortable saying this stuff in public, I don't want to hear from him. Now let's have the public hearing, which should have happened last week anyway. I'll be watching tonight's meeting because it sets the tone, in my opinion, for this year's election, where 4 or 5 members are up for election. What they say tonight and their actions tonight will matter going forward. Are they going to lean towards being open and transparent? Again, we're not asking for inside information on individual students. We're not asking you to break any HIPAA laws. We're talking about policy. When school's going to reopen, whether you can accept signatures, a ridiculous conversation, but certainly not an executive session. If a lawyer has an opinion, say it. We just had planning and zoning meetings where lawyers out in the open are saying, here's our interpretation of that. Here's our view. This is not unusual. If they were talking about a legal settlement, yeah, go behind closed doors. If you're talking about an expulsion hearing, go behind closed doors. HIPAA laws, no question. A legal interpretation on if you can get signatures or not, you're in executive session, what the fuck is wrong with you? Who decided that's a good idea? Before you do it, I would call the Freedom of Information Commission and make sure that a conversation about an interpretation of a rule over accepting signatures should happen behind closed doors in executive session, because it shouldn't. No way should it be. And it's basically telling the public, we're better than you. You're not part of this conversation. We'll invent nonsense reasons to not hear you, and then we'll decide on those decisions behind closed doors. We have a Board of Education whose job it is to hold our administrators accountable. I'm going to add to that, we have a Board of Education whose job it is to hold our administrators and Board of Ed chair accountable. vote no when that executive session vote comes up. Have the discussion in public. We'll all be better off for it. And when CABE is giving their presentation, remember, that's just an opinion from one organization. It's not the law. They can cite cases, they can give you examples. Take it. That's fine. That's advice, but it's just advice. And ask yourself one consistent question throughout that presentation. Would you run for office on this presentation? Would you run for office telling people there are things that you can't say? Or would you run for office saying, we're going to be open and transparent, and I'm going to be an open book, and you can ask me anything you want, and we're going to talk about it? You decide. Decide what your platform for re-election is tonight during CABE's presentation. I think a lot of parents will be watching. I think a lot of parents really want to know. Okay, I had other topics set for today, but that just kind of got under my skin seeing that agenda. And so we'll talk about more things on tomorrow at 4 o'clock. But yeah, and one of the reader questions I want to talk about too is I got a long question about racism in the housing board, and I want to respond to that in great detail tomorrow, because there are some laws at the state level about housing that we have to talk about. Some of the comments before I go, Jen, I agree. Second on the accountability for the Board of Education member, Steve, it's time. Listen, they have a decision to make. Do not be afraid. To the Board of Ed members, I know you get in there, and many of you were not involved in politics before. And they get in, and you're told there's all these rules and all these laws. No, not really. There's laws, sure. But it's not on what you can say. You can't say HIPAA stuff. You can't say stuff that is personal to people, their private medical records or private educational records. You can't do that. But asking about policy, that's your job. Have the conversation. Most people have the common sense not to talk about somebody's personal health records or their personal grades of one student. No one's going to do that. But start questioning things. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of procedure and policy and all that stuff. I know you're flooded with it. You become a board member and everybody emails you, here's this book and this list of rules. Fuck it. Ask questions like a normal human being. Don't be a dick. Don't be an ass. We have RTM members that handle that. Be real. When parents have questions, engage with them on the questions. Find out what they're really asking. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't ask a follow-up question. Your job is to work in the best interest of those kids, period. Don't get locked in the bullshit. Transparency is a crock. I don't know if I agree with that, but I think we have laws supporting some things that will help. Executive session should only be used for real estate transactions, contracts, and security. I very much agree. Anything that puts a town or entity at risk. So if you're giving away your legal strategy, for example, or if you're giving away what you're paying on a contract versus what the bids are, you don't want to do stuff like that. But in this case, it makes absolutely no sense. Executive session should be used so infrequently. Elected must speak in public. I agree. Yeah, if you're elected and you're on the board, have the conversation in public. There are 150 Connecticut towns affiliated with CABE. Just check their website. There's a lot of pressure to join CABE. And what they do is they make sure their board is so big that some member from like almost all these towns are on their board. So there's absolutely it's just nonsense. So there's always going to be some advocate for CABE on the board. Then the members just say, okay, let's just keep paying CABE. And it's tens of thousands of dollars that goes to them. About 2 weeks ago, I put an FOI request to our Board of Education to request all the monies paid to CABE in the last 10 years. When I get that, I'll talk about that on the podcast. But I don't think we're going to like the number. Should we challenge them on the site? Listen, I think you have members on this Board of Education that are reasonable members. What happens so often is everybody talks to the public and they have their ideas and they get in the meeting and they somehow freeze up. Instead of just saying, wait, stop. Let's go. Let's look at this realistically. I'm not just letting these things happening. I'm going to start speaking up. It's okay to be wrong. Speak up and you turn, okay, so be it. But once one or two members start speaking up, more will jump on. You represent the people in the audience. You understand that? You represent 28,000 people in town, not Hamlin Hernandez. You want to do what's best for everybody, yes. But having conversations behind closed doors, having CABE give their policy as if it's law, nonsense. It's not. They're basically consultants. They can give their opinion, but it's not the law. And nothing prevents you as a Board of Ed member from saying what you're thinking or asking real questions and having that conversation in public. Come November, we have many of these members up. After November, let's hope the attitude is we're open, we're transparent, and inclusive with parents in the community. Because right now, while individual members want that, as a board, that's not what's happening. It's certainly not reflected on this agenda. We'll be back tomorrow at 4 o'clock. I'll be watching the meeting. I'm going to record it, maybe out a little bit, but watch the meeting tonight as well. And interesting to see what happens. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to send them, and we'll see you tomorrow at 4 o'clock, guys. I hope you all have a phenomenal night. I will talk to you tomorrow.